So it's now my pleasure to introduce the first speaker for today, Dr. Evan Thompson. Evan is a lifelong friend. Having first encountered each other, Evan was 14. Our fathers knew each other and attended many events created by Evan's father. So we're not going to go into detail about the extraordinary accomplishments of today's speakers for the introduction for each one of you, because your program contains, in their words, what they want you to know. But Evan is currently a professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia. He's the author of Waking, Dreaming, and Being, Mind in Life. He is author with Francisco Varela and Eleanor Roche of the Embodied Mind. And he was a professor at the University of Toronto, and he's recently moved to the University of British Columbia. And he's going to frame, in a very large way, a way to think about what it is that this enterprise may be creating. So Evan.
Thanks very much, Cliff, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks for letting me talk first so that I could really pay attention to everybody else's talks instead of thinking about my own upcoming one. So the take-home message of my talk is that we need to do a much better job of tracking the looping effects at work in the science of mindfulness. And if you don't know what a looping effect is, I'm going to say what that is in a minute. And that embodied cognitive science, that is the embodied approach in cognitive science, or embodied cognition as it's sometimes called, that it can help us do this. It can help us track looping effects. So what do I mean by looping effects? The modern mindfulness looping effect comes from starting by conceptualizing mindfulness as inward-looking awareness and inward regulation of the individual mind. And then taking that conception, so a kind of internalist, individualist conception, projecting it onto the brain, thereby endowing it with a biological reality, biologist sizing it, you could say. And the result then is an individualist conception of the mindful subject, superimposed onto a neural substrate. And then the looping effect comes from that whole construct looping back onto how we conceptualize ourselves. So we'll see not just journalists, but scientists saying things like, to be a mindful parent, or a mindful coworker, or a mindful soldier, you need to learn how to down-regulate your amygdala through mindfulness training. So we conceptualize ourselves through the construct of mindfulness as something happening inside me. We take ourselves to be our brains in some fundamental sense, and then we redescribe ourselves that way, and we organize social practices around that kind of construct. So this is an example of what the philosopher Ian Hacking meant when he introduced the term looping effect. We create a category, we treat it as real, and then we reconceptualize ourselves in terms of the category. And here the treating of it as real means we treat it as real by way of the biological substrate, because neuroscience has a tremendous authority for us in our culture. So there are two problematic assumptions that I want to highlight that are underlying this looping effect. One is treating mindfulness as internal awareness of the individual mind. And the second is taking the mind to be generated by and located inside the brain. And so I'm going to be focusing on both of these problematic assumptions, and I'm going to be doing so by way of an image that appeared in the Scientific American article that Cliff mentioned. And I've raised these complaints with the authors, so I'm not sort of speaking behind their backs here. In this article, there was this image presented where a number of contemplative practices were distinguished: focused attention, mindfulness or open monitoring, compassion and loving kindness. And then focused attention was identified in terms of a kind of cycle of mental processes that were identified with neural regions, or neural regions as nodes of networks, where mind wandering is identified with, say, the default network, then becoming aware of distraction is identified with the salience network, and then reorientation and sustaining of focus of attention are identified with dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So what we have is we have a map in which certain cognitive functions or cognitive processes, mind wandering, distraction awareness, reorientation of attention, sustaining focus of attention, are identified with regions in the first instance, and then the more sophisticated qualification would just be to say, well, the regions are markers for networks. But if you look at the image itself that's being represented or that's being presented, it's very much the regions that are being highlighted. Okay, so I'm going to present two critical arguments against this way of thinking that highlight for me a number of really important points that are at stake in what's going on. So here's the first argument, and being a philosopher, we like to lay out, our arguments in premise to conclusion form. The first one is that mindfulness, in quotation marks, because how we define that is, of course, a big question, but I'm going to submit baldly that however we define mindfulness, it consists in an integrated exercise of a host of cognitive, affective, and bodily skills in context, in what cognitive scientists would call situated action, in context of embeddedness. So that's first point. Second point is that brain processes, this is a conceptual point, are necessary enabling conditions of mindfulness. They facilitate it, but they're only partially constitutive of it. That is to say that mindfulness can't be exhaustively accounted for in terms of things like neural regions and networks of neural activity. And moreover, those brain regions and networks become constitutive only given the wider context of embodied and embedded cognition and action. Without that context, they wouldn't function in the partially constitutive way that they do. So they're necessarily enabling or facilitating conditions of something that's actually context situated and much wider. So it's a conceptual mistake then to superimpose mindfulness onto the differential activation of distinct neural networks in the way that that diagram in Scientific American does. Okay, so if that's all very abstract, here's an analogy. Parenting, however we might define that, and of course that's going to be dependent on context, dependent on culture. Parenting consists in the integrated exercise of a host of cognitive, affective, and bodily skills in situated action, especially if it's good parenting, whatever that might mean in whatever context. Brain processes facilitate that. They're necessary enabling conditions of parenting, but they're only partially constitutive of it. And they become constitutive only given a wider context, the context of, say, the family, the context of what counts as a family in a certain society. So it's just a confusion, a conceptual mistake to superimpose parenting onto the differential activation of neural networks. Okay, so that's argument one. Second argument, and I'll take a little bit more time with this one, is that when we attribute a cognitive function to a system, like the function of attention, we're talking about the whole system in context, the whole embodied subject. Now, this is arguable, but it seems unlikely, and I'll cite some evidence or considerations in support of this. It seems unlikely that there's any one-one mapping between cognitive functions and neural networks, especially as currently identified using fMRI, that the mapping from function to network is many-many, not one-one, and it's many-many because it's context-dependent and dynamically changing and variable. So it's empirically unwarranted to map the cognitive functions constitutive of mindfulness onto distinct neural networks, especially as currently identified using fMRI, which was the basis for the Scientific American figure that I started with. Okay, so I want to go through each of these steps in a little bit more detail. So this first point, that attributions of cognitive function, like attention, apply at the level of the whole embodied subject. So here I want to call your attention to a work by a colleague of mine in the philosophy department at UBC called Attention is Cognitive Unison. And basically what Christopher Moll argues in this book is that attention is not a distinct process in the brain, but a mode in which multiple cognitive processes unfold in relation to each other. So rather than trying to identify it in terms of a particular neural process, it has to do with all sorts of things going on, being coherent or in unison, as he puts it, that mode of processing is cognitive unison. So that task-relevant cognitive processes, whatever they might be in whatever context, are operating in unison within a certain window of time, where what would be facilitating unison in the brain might be, if you have a biased competition model, it might have to do with biased competition, or if you're thinking in terms of neural phase synchrony, it has to do with the coherence of oscillatory activity within certain frequencies, within a certain window of time. That's a level of description in terms of more biological specificity, but at a higher level, what's happening is that there's a phenomenon of cognitive unison. And just as there's no place in the orchestra where unison resides, that's not the kind of phenomenon that unison is. It's a relational phenomenon. It doesn't sit in any particular place. So there's no place where attention resides in the brain. That when we talk about attention, we're talking at a different level of explanation and description. So given that point, mapping sustained attention onto the dorsolateral PFC, for example, even as a node of a network, that's a category mistake. It's a kind of conceptual confusion. In certain contexts, that region facilitates attention, but it doesn't generate or constitute attention. Okay, so then second point in this critical argument, the point about it's unlikely that there's any one-one mapping between cognitive functions and neural networks. So here I'm relying on work by Michael Anderson and Luis Pessoa, who in a series of articles have argued this point. And in the article at the top, what they did is they did a meta-analysis of a whole bunch of fMRI studies looking at networks that are identified, functional connectivity networks that are identified in fMRI, and they created what they call functional fingerprints, where, for example, the default network or frontal parietal network is displayed in terms of all of the different kinds of task situations that it shows up in experimentally. And so these different networks have different functional fingerprints, but the point is that they're mobilized in all sorts of different contexts. So flattening their description down into it correlates with this particular phenomenon of sustained attention in the way that the diagram representing focused attention meditation does is just an incredible simplification. Now, this is an arguable point, but Pessoa argues for it, I think, pretty compellingly, which is to say that although everybody would agree that the mapping from neural regions to cognitive processes is many, many, people want to say, well, no, but the relevant unit of analysis is the network, and that's not going to be many, many. But Pessoa argues, or presents a good case, I think, for thinking that the many, many mapping is going to hold in terms of networks and cognitive processes as well. So two networks can instantiate similar cognitive processes, for example, and it can go the other way because individual variability, context dependence, dynamical change over time in what these networks are doing is going to make this mapping many, many. So for those two reasons, then, it doesn't make sense empirically either to map the cognitive constitutive, the cognitive functions constitutive of mindfulness, however we're using the term mindfulness, onto distinct neural networks in the way that is being done in the literature. Okay, so that's the kind of critical part. What I want to do now is say that we can look at this differently if we use the framework of embodied cognitive science. And specifically what I'm thinking of here is what's sometimes called 4E cognition or 4E cognitive science, where, and I'm going to go through each of these, there's an emphasis on cognitive processes as embodied, as embedded, as extended, and then as enactive. So let me say something about those. So the idea that cognition is embodied is that it depends directly on the body as a functional whole and not just the brain. So to give you an example, in the case of visual perception, if you hold the visual stimulus fixed, it's an optic flow stimulus in this particular experiment that I'm thinking of. So the stimulus is exactly the same, but the perception of the 3D structure, perception of depth, differs according to whether you are actively moving your body in relationship to it or whether your body is being passively moved in relationship to it. So this is Mark Wexler's work. So the point here is that self-generated motor activity, motor signals, proprioceptive signals, directly contributes to the content of what you see. So that motor action is constitutive of the perception. It's not just a passive process in which you could be moving not in virtue of your own self-generated activity, but being passively carried along in relationship to the stimulus. So that's a case of what embodiment would mean in the domain of visual perception. Think of walking meditation, for example, where you have a practice that involves self-generated movement and mindfulness of movement. The movement is the content of the visual experience is in part determined by the fact of movement and the signals that are the motor and proprioceptive signals. In the study of language and thought, David McNeil's work calls attention to gesture and also music, as we just saw and heard, where gesture isn't a mere adornment or accompaniment to speaking and thinking. It's an integral component of them. So McNeil argues that gesture actually is thought and action, and if you're not able to gesture, you're not able to speak and think in certain ways. There's the movement or the approach that Larry Barsalou calls grounded cognition. The basic idea here is that instead of there being a kind of central cognitive system that's amodal for math or for language, that doesn't depend on particular sensory motor or perceptual modalities, that cognitive phenomena are grounded in and emerge from a variety of bodily processes, where that means affective, perceptual, and motor processes. So this is the work on grounded cognition. So that's all by way of the idea of embodiment. Second, embedded. This term comes from the study of things like navigation, where in work by Randy Beer, the idea is that you treat the nervous system, the body, and the environment as coupled dynamical systems in which behavior is a property of the entire brain-body environment system and can't be attributed to any component in isolation. Third, extended. This, I think, is especially important in thinking about mindfulness. In work by Michael Tomasello, he argues, and here he's building on Vygotsky, among other theorists, that the apparently inward-looking mental capacities of metacognition and meta-awareness, both constituents of mindfulness under various definitions of mindfulness, that those are actually internalized forms of social cognition. And they're dependent on our being able to share intentions, that is, to have a mutual understanding of intentions that we both have, to imitate others, and to share attention, or the phenomenon of joint attention. That these cognitive capacities are required for metacognition and meta-awareness. So it's not as if you start with an internal view. You actually start with an outside view that you internalize. And mindfulness, especially versions of mindfulness that emphasize the metacognitive monitoring, would be an instance of this, something that actually is constitutively dependent on social cognition. Extending that point even further, work by Merlin Donald, he argues in a number of publications, beginning with this book in 1991, that the human brain is a cultural brain in the sense that it's adapted to the environment of symbolic culture. Modern mind here means modern Homo sapiens. So the brain of the Homo sapiens is adapted to the environment of symbolic culture. It can't function properly unless it's embedded in that environment. And he talks about biological memory and external memory, say in the form of writing, or now for us with computer technologies, that constitutes an extended hybrid cognitive system. So what counts as memory is not just what's in the head, it's a feature of an extended system that's culturally embedded and culturally constituted. So this is what we meant when we used the term enactive, going back to the book with Francisco Varela and Eleanor Roche, that in being embodied, embedded, and extended, cognition enacts or brings forth a lived world of meaning and relevance rather than representing a pre-specified world. Okay, so coming then into the end, the implications of this perspective, the embodied cognition perspective, is that mindfulness, in however we want to talk about the meaning of that word, is embodied, is embedded, is extended, and is enactive. It's a way of sense-making. Its constituent cognitive capacities, so voluntary mental attention, or metacognition, or smriti sati in the sense of holding in mind, recollective remembrance, that those are internalized forms of social cognition. So we can't understand those cognitive processes unless we have a rich view of the human mind as structured through social cognition. So mindfulness in any form then is a social practice, not just a psychological process. So concluding then, embodied cognitive science, I would propose, offers a different explanatory framework from that of the neuroscience model of mindfulness, at least as currently practiced in the main. The model is one in which context is constitutive and context is irreducibly embodied, embedded, extended, and enactive. Now, it's an open question, I think, whether pursuing that approach can ameliorate the deleterious looping effects of the neuroscience of mindfulness. So by deleterious effects, I mean things like the consumerist construction of the mindful subject that we saw some wonderful images of, or not so wonderful, depending on how you want to look at it, that Cliff showed us. So it's an open question, I think, how much that's going to help. But my hope is that it can. I mean, that's my motivation for presenting this framework, is that it can help us deal with thinking about these looping effects and maybe shifting them in certain ways. So the next steps, then, would be to begin by de-reifying, or indeed one might even say de-fetishizing mindfulness through analyses of the social factors at work in mindfulness practices and analyses of the diverse and sometimes contradictory conceptions of mindfulness at work in Buddhist contexts and in secular contexts. And that's meant to point to things that I believe Bob and John are going to talk about in different ways. And then to use those analyses to generate new kinds of investigative questions for an embodied cognitive science of mindfulness practices, one in which we would need to see a much stronger role played by cognitive anthropology and also by science studies to track what it is that we're doing when we construct these categories, represent them in terms of, say, a neurological substrate, and then conceptualize ourselves through that kind of construction. My point is not that we can do away with looping effects. Looping effects are always going to be there. My point is that we have an epistemological and ethical duty to track them, and that we need anthropology and science studies as part of the investigative team in order to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. We have time for some questions. Comments. We'll have time from discussants in a bit, but Philippe.
You said you spoke with the authors of this Scientific American article. Are you at liberty to share?
What they said?
Yeah. Or the response to your thoughts and ideas?
So they agreed and pleaded the pressure that Scientific American put on them to construct the representation in a certain way. And they tried to nuance it. This is what Richie told me. They tried to nuance it, and that they really came up against pressure.
They essentially weren't allowed to.
Yeah. So, I mean, that doesn't surprise me to hear. Yeah. But I think, I mean, if we just were to take that as meaning, oh, it's not really a problem, it's just a problem with, science journalism, then I think that would not be right. I mean, because we, myself included, we all, I think, fall into this way of thinking about, we all fall into this looping effect that I described. So, I mean, I've said things in which I've fallen into it too. It's not as if I'm immune from it. So that's, I think the important thing is we become more vigilant about that.
Hi, thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. So I'm going to just be a little bit of a maybe devil's advocate, which is to say, what would you say if I said, okay, we can do a new Thompson figure, we can put in 3 more motor networks and some eye gaze trading, and just have a kind of slightly more complicated figure? Is that, I mean, it seems like you're saying something more than that. And what's the sort of like revolutionary outside the box part? And what is sort of like, let's just expand our networks, expand it to other people, expand it to the motor system, expand it to hand gesture, which it seems to me is in a way a sort of incremental move.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I would say that the more radical part would be that we need to really step back and reconfigure it in a sociocultural way, and make that the starting point, and then understand the biology in terms of what's going on in the sociocultural context. That's the radical part. Radical, not in the sense that other people haven't thought of it, but just in the sense that that's not the way we normally go about it. And then all the other things, the adding in the motor processes and so on, are going to be situated differently if we do that. So adding in the motor stuff, that's great.
Or even
but
even adding
in and
in
of
like
itself,
2- and 3-person networks. I mean, it seems like a lot of what you're saying can sort of be recuperated into a new figure fairly easily.
Well, so there's two
not
things.
easily, but-
There's two things to say about that. One is figures are abstractions and representations, and we need to remember that, and we often forget it, especially when we're seduced by the image of the brain. So if we complexify our figures in a way that lessens that particular seductive power of the brain as it's presented to us normally, then I think that's good. But we would still need to remember it's a representation, and it's not, the map is not the territory.
Thanks.
Yeah.
You can't study everything all at once.
Right.
So do you have specific proposals about how so essentially we have to do analysis, break things apart into things that we can study in practical terms. Are you suggesting that we need to have a different way of breaking apart, let's say, brain function? Or are you proposing some new method of analysis?
So the new method part would be that I think the investigative team needs to have cognitive anthropologists and critical science studies people as part of the team. And that's happening in some places. So that's on the methodological side. I'm not going to dictate to neuroscientists how they should develop their methods in EEG or fMRI or something like that. That's not for me to say. It's more how those methods fit into a context that includes other things, and that so that they get framed differently from the way they're usually framed.
Philosophers always know what the weakest part of their argument is. So what would you say is the most debatable, but profound but debatable point you were trying to make during your talk?
I mean, everything is debatable. One person's modus ponens is another person's modus tollens. You know that. I mean, so you can get off anywhere you want in the argument. But I think the substantive issue that's maybe most interesting to think about is how much would shifting the focus from a brain-centered one to a socio-cultural one in which the brain is situated, how productive is that for any given field of investigation? And how much would we want to pursue that? That's the substantive question that would be debatable, I suppose. Yeah.
Thank you. We're going to move on.
Thanks.